Hold their hearts when I'm not there. When trials come to test their faith, let them know the power of prayer. Hold their lives in your hands. When the world tries to push them down, provide the grace to stand. Hold them close when I can't. And so, with that, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. We're going to talk about one of the most controversial questions that can ever come out of a toddler's mouth. Mommy, where do babies come from? This is a question that has stumped parents, teachers, and church leaders on, we just can't know how to begin in talking to our children about sex. And so today's discussion will mainly focus on children, not teens. All right, this is in shaping our children from as early as 0 years old onwards. And so this is a hard question because, there seems to be like a growing disconnect between how we see ourselves as Christian and how we actually live those lives out, especially in the conversation of sex. It is my goal that we as a Christian community talk about these tough questions, pull our resources together, and be each other's support in how to handle these awkward conversations with our kids. And so tonight's devotion and discussion will not be an answer to everything, but it is my hope that it will at least spark an openness and a willingness to listen and learn. And why? Because it is just important. The sex talk helps lay the foundation and equip our children for a biblical worldview of healthy sexuality and a biblical sexual ethic. But before we start, I'd like to ask Pastor Hardiniano to please open us up with prayer.
Our most gracious and kind Heavenly Father, we humbly come before you this moment, realizing our nothingness. We would like to affirm your presence through your Holy Spirit, that as we delve into some deeper knowledge in making it understandable for our young children, we pray for your wisdom that you endow our host, Sister Johan, tonight. May it be that you give her as you have been using her in the past. I pray that you'll use her mightily tonight. Give her wisdom that she will be able to expand the knowledge of everybody that is listening. Bless each of the parent. Give them the courage to tell uh, and how to tell the ethical way of doing things. Thank you that you will be with us and for helping us in the understanding of the topic that will be presented tonight. In Jesus' name, amen.
And so I'd like to start with just like a small little story. I remember when Melody was about a year and a half old, we went to visit the Turtleback Zoo. And oddly enough, true to its name, we happened to see two turtles on top of each other. You know, and as any curious toddler would ask, Melody asked, Mommy, what are they doing? And, at that time, I had a surge of thoughts run through my head. And in that moment of panic, I said, they're mating. I tried to say it in the most like matter of fact tone as I can. And I was glad that Melody just took it for what it was. They're mating. Now, suddenly, a large family came by to see what the spectacle was. And a young boy promptly asked the mother a similar question Melody asked from before. Mommy, why are the two turtles on each other's backs? Oh, they're exercising, she answered, to which Melody abruptly inserted, No, they're mating. And I picked her up and ran off like there was no tomorrow. When we hear the word sex, we feel as though we are like in the danger zone and we kind of just want to run off like there's no tomorrow also. But that goes really for any crucial conversation because we are presented with opposing opinions, strong emotions, and high stakes. So it's understandable to be stumped, to not know how to begin, and to try to avoid it as much as we can, or maybe delegate it to someone else. So in the book, Child Guidance, Ellen White actually counsels us as parents to take on the reins of teaching our children. And so today we're going to be reading from the book Child Guidance, and I'm going to be sharing a reading of that. And I encourage everyone to take a look at your screens. That way, you will be able to not only listen, but see and read the words at the same time. And this better enhances our learning.
Education begins at home. It is in the home that the education of the child is to begin. Here is his first school. Here, with his parents as instructors, he is to learn the lessons that are to guide him throughout life. Lessons of respect, obedience, reverence, self-control. The educational influences of the home are a decided power for good or for evil. They are in many respects silent and gradual, but if exerted on the right side, they become a far-reaching power for truth and righteousness. If the child is not instructed aright here, Satan will educate him through agencies of his choosing. How important, then, is the school in the home?
Education begins at home. We are warned that if it doesn't start at home, Satan, as the last line of the passage says, will educate them through the agencies of his choosing. Now, what are these different agencies that Satan uses? So, these agencies, of course, are it should start first in the home and then at church, then later towards school, and then lastly will be media. But while that represents the ideal order, where it first starts at home and then the church and the school then become like assets for the family, and the last line of information is media, which is the internet, the music, the movies, and the books. But if we're being honest, the rather more realistic picture really is that it starts it opposite way, where it starts with the media first, that the children get their first line of sex education from through mass media. And then later on in their school and amongst themselves as the children talk. And then if they're lucky, the church, and then maybe us as parents. Today, the youth has questions that outweigh answers we have available for them. If they don't learn from us as parents, they will learn it from other places. And we don't want that. But don't let that get you down, for in fact, though how unequipped you may feel that you are, our influence as parents surpass that of whatever teacher, youth group, club ministry, or friends your child could ever have. You see, the average church only has about 40 hours a year to influence your child. If you're a part of our church and if you're a part of the adventurers and the pathfinders, then let's say that's about 150 hours a year for your child. But the average parent, and that's the average working parent, busy parent, has 3,000 hours a year. So if you see here, there is no program or church that could ever compete with the leverage of time parents have with their kids. So, before we could even answer, Mommy, where do babies come from? We as parents need to lay down the right foundation and have this. We need to have a shift change in our mindset. And this begins right here. We must first acknowledge that God, in his infinite wisdom, called us as parents to raise our kids. This gives us a huge responsibility that has eternal implications. In this, we are to parent with love towards our kids, to have open communication, to prioritize time in our busyness, and approach our conversations with them with intentionality. If we don't have these things in place, if we're too busy to entertain questions, if we haven't had enough time to establish trust to have crucial conversations, then how are we going to fulfill God's calling in us? In reality, great parenting great family relationship, and a strong, passionate, vibrant Christian faith doesn't just happen. They take daily, strategic, intentional, prayerful living. And so that's the first thing we need to do. We need to shift that mindset and know that the responsibility lies in us. Secondly, we need to shift our mindset on innocence. While we as parents should protect our child's innocence for as long as necessary, we as parents should also be ready to let that innocence melt away at the appropriate time so that purity can take over and rule the soul, right? You see, innocence is for a season, it's not for a lifetime. There comes a time in every child's life when they are ready to take on a little more weight on their shoulders, ready to understand this world that we live in and how to be in it but not of it. They are ready to embark upon a life of purity. Innocence and purity are two different things. Innocence is not knowing, just being naive, while purity is a path of integrity amid a world of sin. So we can be knowledgeable and pure about sex. So we shouldn't shy our children away from that conversation. Proverbs 27:12 tells us, and I'm reading from the easy read version, tells us that wise people see trouble coming and get out of the way, while fools go straight to the trouble and suffer for it. So, in equipping our children with knowledge, we are actually protecting them. When we allow them to truly recognize that their bodies are temples of God and that all of us are sexual and spiritual beings, we give them the power to have self respect, to know where to put boundaries, to understand consent, and to know that God has big plans for them. But what does this really look like in practical terms? Now, I am by no means an expert in this category. The practical tips that I will be sharing is just what I've researched and learned throughout my years as a parent, which hasn't been very long. My oldest is only about to be 13. So, but if you've been following along our Zoom meetings, you might be familiar with my testimony. I gave a talk on premarital sex about 2 weeks ago. You can find that video in our Filipino English SDA Church Facebook page, where you will also see other related topics that our church has covered, like pornography and how to prepare our kids for the kingdom. And so if you've listened into that, because I felt that I've become quite the precautionary tale, I prayed and prayed to God to give me wisdom and to help JR and I in raising our girls. So I'll be sharing a few practical tips that I've learned, and later on we're going to open this up for discussion so that other parents and maybe children that are now all grown up, young adults, can share of their experience growing up, or we can all learn from each other no matter what walks in life we're in. And so here's my first practical tip. Sex education can begin as early as birth. Now, I say this because I want to emphasize that sex education is not like the big talk that you're going to give your children one day when you think that they're ready. What we call like the birds and the bees talk. It's not one big talk, but rather it is an ongoing conversation that builds up in time, sharing information appropriately at a time, and it has no end. Because just think about it. If sex education was just that one big talk that you were going to talk to your kids, are we not going to be with them as they struggle with temptation, as they struggle with their mistakes with sexual immorality later on? Are we not going to be with them through that time as parents? And when they get married and when when they have troubles with their spouse in that regard, if they would ever come to you, you want that to still be an open conversation. And of course, later on, when they have their kids, you'd like them to come to you for that wisdom. And so it is an ongoing conversation. It's not just one big momentous talk. And so that's why I say that it begins as early as birth. How we've done that in our family. I remember that even when we were like changing diapers, we were always conscious of prying eyes. Um, it was not to be overprotective or anything like that, but in a way, we were training our family to just be hyper vigilant of predators because sadly, this is just the kind of world that we live in. And of course, as from a baby, as they later grow up, we teach them all the different body parts that they have. We started calling body parts for what they are. Let's say this is your eyes, this is your ears, this is your nose. Okay, this is your vulva. Now, nicknaming body parts. In our culture, especially in the Filipino culture, we have like different names for these parts, and it's just part of who we are as a people. But when we teach our children solely only those nicknames and not teaching them what the actual names are, we are somehow creeping in shame. And I say that because when we not call things for what they are, when we nickname things, it's saying that we can't talk about it. And when we can't talk about it, okay, so we will walk around it. The main goal that's best to have around 0 to 5 years old is equipping your child with the vocabulary that they need. Supplying them with this vocabulary will help you later on as you are building the blocks, as you continue on this conversation about sex. And so in the beginning, a lot of it is really just physiological stuff, calling things for what they are, naming the body parts for what they are. I remember when Melody asked me, where do babies come from? How do I get pregnant? Because I was pregnant with Musette. And so, of course, she would naturally ask, where did Musette come from and things like that. I just answered it in the most scientific way that I could. It took daddy's sperm and mommy's egg. And together we have Musette. And as Musette was growing, we learned about all the physiological changes that I was getting through as I was pregnant. And we learned a little bit about the reproductive system, about where the baby comes out and things like that, because for our family at that time, it was what felt the most natural. So when you keep that open conversation in your family, you can find little tidbits of opportunity that will just come and you see them as like teaching moments for your kids. So from around 0 to 5 years old, most of this is just very scientific. The talks in just terms of like the physiology and the biology of things. And at that time, I was trying my best not to put the morality talk in it just yet. Like, for example, so Musette, she already knew the terms such as mating. She knew what a penis and a vagina was. She knew what a sperm and an egg was, but she wasn't familiar with the act of sex itself. One day we were at church and one of the Sabbath school lessons was about sex. I don't know if you guys remember that, but we had like a Sabbath school lessons and like for the whole quarter or something, it was about that. There was no children's ministry Sabbath school at that time, so we sat along with the adults, and I had Musette with me there at church. So Musette asked, "Mommy, what is sex?" And because we already had building blocks of vocabulary before this, it was just easy for me to say, "Oh, it's mating." And then Melody was there, and then Melody told her, "Oh, like when animals mate, humans mate too." And so Musette took that as an answer. Oh, okay, so that's sex. I avoided saying, okay, but don't do that until you're married, okay? And sometimes we tend to do that because we want to inject our values right away, but there's an appropriate time for all these things. And I didn't want to do it right away at that time because I didn't want her to think of the shame when she was just thinking of it as just of it in a box. It was just a biological talk. And the funny thing about it was that later on she asked, "Oh, so mommy, animals have mating seasons. So does that mean that Valentine's is mating seasons for humans?" It was just things like this just come up in our conversations daily as like it is just a normal part of our parenting. Later on, of course, as the child grows up, around when they're like 6 to 10 years old, they care a lot about their peers. They talk a lot about they talk to their friends a lot on all these things, and they try to gather information from other people. And so it is at this time that it's best to concentrate on the spiritual development of things. So like, from around birth to around 5, you talk a lot about the physiological stuff. And then later on, you now have those building blocks to put the spiritual stuff in place. Of course, God is always an ongoing conversation. And so now you can put that in with what they already know with sex. And so we talk that about the plan in God's life and things like that, because especially because I have girls around 9 to 12 years old, they're going to be facing menstruation and puberty, because it can start as early as 9. And so you want to be able to have those building blocks already in place, or else you're going to have like a really hard time explaining what all their questions are about their body. Another wonderful way to do that is to celebrate that rite of passage when that time comes. I remember when Melody got her menstruation, we made a sort of like celebration about it, where we bought her the things that she needs, like her napkins and like things like that. And then like I'm teaching her how to take care in terms of hygiene and things like that. And because she was already at that right moment where I can come in and come to talk to her more deeply of the things that we've continuously already been talking about, I was then able to explain to her how the menstruation works, that now her body is actually ready to have children later on. And we talked more about what God's plan is for her and things like that. And it was a really long conversation. And it was one that was just open. Of course, it was awkward. It was very awkward for me. It was also awkward for Melody. There were times when we were talking to each other and our heads were just on our pillows. We weren't looking at each other, but at least the conversation was there. And one of the books that I got her was this, and this one's a very nice book. This is called The Girl Guide. There's also a boy equivalent for this, but one that I cannot really vouch for because I haven't read. But the Girl Guide is very good because it covers topics as, stretch marks and first period, pimples, and like things like that. Because these are things that you don't want your kids to be ashamed about, because this is all part of their sexuality. Sex education is not just about the act itself. It is a myriad of things. And so the best thing that you can do is to put the building blocks that you need to have the proper conversation in place. And that starts really young. I have 4 rules that I try to keep. And this spells the word core, CORE. So this is what I do when I engage in conversation with my girls. C is I want to appear that I'm curious. C is for curious. I ask questions like, why did you ask that? Oh, what made you ask that question? Was there something that you've read? I want to see where they're coming from and things like that. So when we talk about our ongoing conversations about sex education, I want to be curious about what they're thinking, what their thoughts are, and whatever their answers are, there are clearly no judgment. I'm just asking because I'm curious. And the next one is, oh, I need to be open and willing. We need to be willing because anything we fear, anything that we avoid, we should be open and lean towards it. No, we have to be willing to know our child. And so I have to be curious, and most of all, I have to be open. And third is R, which I have to be respectful. So I have to be respectful for the children, especially when they come at me with their questions. Maybe they were looking at something online that they shouldn't be looking at. Maybe they were talking to people about things that they're not supposed to be talking about. I can't come at them and be like, why? Why are you doing this? How dare you? Because they are still in that process of learning and things like that. So I have to be respectful to where they are in their walk. And that takes a lot of restraint. Just again, going back to, I have to be curious, I have to be open, and I have to be respectful. And lastly is E, I have to be empathetic. Good choices are hard to make for kids. We tell them all the time to make good choices, but making them is actually really hard. So we have to have empathy in knowing just how hard it is for them, as it's hard growing up. I don't know, sometimes as adults we kind of forget how hard puberty was, how hard that whole identity crisis was. And so we have to be empathetic to them. Sometimes they will express problems that don't make sense to us, that seem like such a huge thing, but we have to be empathetic when they come to us with those problems. Those are my main guiding principles when I'm communicating with my children. CORE. I have to be curious, I have to be open and willing, I have to be respectful, and of course, I have to be empathetic. And the verbiage that I can supply you guys with when you're talking with your kids is, you can tell them things like, that's a great question. Thank you for trusting me with that question. You know, if you want to confront them about something, maybe it could be masturbation, or it could be maybe a porn site that you found in their computer history, or like things like that. You can say, I found something I need to talk to you about. I'm not pleased with it and I want to help you through this. Instead of using the language of shame. And the language of shame is mainly saying, I can't believe you did this. How dare you? You know better. In order to have this good conversation with our kids, is that we have to be open. Right now, speaking of open, I'm going to open the floor for discussions and questions, just so that we can learn from each other. I know that it's usually hard to kind of open up this conversation. And so I'm just going to ask Pastor Ralph. I asked him earlier if he can share a little something on his thoughts about this topic.
Everything that was said was appropriate. It's really knowing where their development is and addressing their developmental needs, and being open to always reminding them that, when they have a question, whether it's relevant to what we're talking about tonight or just a general question, to always say, yes, you can ask me anything. I think is really important, because it could be just a question about school. It could be just a question about, other things. But whenever they ask you, say, dad or mom, can I ask you a question? That's the time where you can plant the seed of saying, sure, you can ask me a question. You can always ask me anything. It's something that I usually say in my relationship with Mia. We're in the car, I'm driving home from school, and she'll share something about her day, and then she'll sometimes throw in a question. And I'm like, sure, Mia, you can ask me a question. And I just add that extra note. You can always ask me anything, because you want that door to be open. And depending on their stage, like Johan said, it's talking about puberty or the development of the body and the stages that they're in. But sometimes it's like you said, you're out in nature and things just pop up, and if you're clear at that time, then you don't need to clarify anything in the future if you put it in its proper context. Because there should be no shame when talking about the things of God. So I think that's great, the way it was put out tonight. So thank you, Johan.
So I agree with what you said regarding having pet names. Like some people would have pet names for discussing parts of the body. It's really important to really name it what it is, because it avoids confusion, like you said. And it's true. Even as a young, when Mia was younger, she was even 3 or 4, I would say, because she heard it from older people, butt, for example, right? So I said, Mia, either you say the full word, like buttocks, or you name it gluteus maximus, which it is. So Mia knows those things. And I think it really helps, for to avoid what you would say, avoid, I'm getting stuck, hold on, to avoid later on when people touches your body, their bodies inappropriately, they would know where their boundaries are, because we talked about it too. So I agree with what you said regarding development and their stage of development when they're ready to discuss things like that. You know, like we tell Mia she has a rectangle zone, you know, the boundary zone, and that to voice it out if something makes her uncomfortable, even by just people insinuating the way they talk. If it's uncomfortable to say it, to tell the person it's uncomfortable, and to tell us. So it really has to be open and it really has to start young.
I liked how you emphasized about, naming things what they are. Jaylene is funny. She likes calling the butt the gluteus maximus. It's like something very royal.
Well, it sounds a lot better, right?
I guess it sounds better than booty, I suppose.
Yes.
But
It
speaking of
sounds
that,
big.
when we look outside society and think, I want you guys right now just to think about all the different terms they use for the word sex. All right, and I don't want to like say everything here, but let's say for example they would use this word, or oh, I'm so sorry, I sent it as a direct message to someone. I did not mean to say that to you. All right, so they would use these words, but like these are like just some of like the words that they use to like describe sex. And if you think about how the world calls it, right, or nicknames it and things like that, you just have to like think about what is more of like the biblical worldview. What would be the more proper word that you think God would use? And God would just simply call it for what it is, because it's not a bad word: sex. But a lot of the times as parents we're kind of like, I don't know what to do, like we don't want to say the word, but the word itself is not bad, because they're going to hear that word in different forms outside. And let's say for private parts, a lot of the times, a lot of the terms that they use for describing a woman's vagina or a woman's vulva are things like that pertains to like fruits or like an animal or like a plant, and it describes it like women are meant to be consumed, because that's what counterfeit sex is. And then if you look at in terms of men, and in the verbiage that they use to describe their penis, it's like calling it junior or like calling it a name, insinuating that, what, it has a mind of its own. It's very animalistic, and these are all stuff that describe counterfeit sex, and it's not what godly sex is. And so that's why it's important to just call it for how it is. Is there someone else that would like to share their thoughts on it?
What I want to contribute is that, as awkward as it may be to have that conversation with your kids, it needs to happen, because you that have a Christian background and a better understanding of how sex in all of its definition is, it's important that the conversation is had within that context. Because in my case, actually till this day, I've never had that conversation with my parents. It just never came up. And what happens is that as a curious child, I had a lot of friends from my neighborhood. They did not grow up in a Christian home. So the things that they learned out of their curiosity, I get to learn from them out of the Christian context. And from that moment, I learned what that was from a distorted point of view, rather than the healthy point of view. And that's why I implore that you talk to your kids, because if you don't, someone else will, and that someone else might give them a misguided representation of what it is, and that can have serious consequences down the road. Because if you learn from a friend that there are certain websites for adults, and you have access to those, you might create some dependencies on that because of the misguided information that you got in the first place.
Thank you for sharing that, Jonathan. And yes, We learned earlier from the Ellen White quote that we read that if the home is not the forefront of the education for our kids, then Satan is going to find other avenues for it. Someone direct messaged me, asked a question here, and maybe I can direct this to the pastors or anyone else that feels that they'd like to share something for this person that can give this person some healing. So she shared that she has gone through sexual abuse as a child, and while she has already forgiven those that have sexually abused her, she finds it hard now to talk to her children about sex or even just saying it. And she even also finds it uncomfortable to talk to adults about it, all because of the trauma that is associated with that word. I completely understand where she's coming from. I also have experienced molestation as a child. The thing is, a lot of the discomfort, coming from the trauma and things like that, it really comes from us adults being uncomfortable about it. And when we are uncomfortable about it, then we also present it to our children like we're uncomfortable, and it will show. So does anyone out there would like to give this young mother some advice on how she can have healing in her life and how she associates with sex so that she can also give the proper education for her kids?
The best way to deal with it is that the very first thing, she must be able to forgive that individual. After forgiving, she has to face her children or her child in a manner that she can explain. She has to explain, and she can, we can say precautionary measures so that the thing that had happened to her will not be repeated again to this young child. She can give a caution, and she can teach in the way that you have explained tonight. Yeah, that is the best way so far that I have listened to. And it is important that the very first thing really is you have to forgive. If you cannot forgive, you don't have peace. I can be certain with that. The second, you have to teach and follow the methods that you have stated. The core that you were trying to mention is an awesome acronym that could be a very good thing that can be done, remembering that individual. So that still could be followed. And it should be something that you have to be determined to do it, because it takes a lot of prayer when you have experienced bad things and trying to do things better than what you have passed.
That's definitely true. The path to healing is long. Pastor Ralph and JR, you wanted to say something? Let me give time to Pastor Ralph and then JR.
I think it's okay when you're able to say, I can't talk about the topic, but I know there's a need to address the topic and to bring someone else into the discussion. And I think the context of forgiving doesn't always necessarily mean you're able to move on. It's a process. It's a lifelong process, and it's not a journey meant to be alone. And one of the most beautiful parts of that process is when you're able to share, like yourself, Sister Johan, when you share your past, it allows other people to find healing. They begin to realize, like, you know what, I can do that. And I think that's beautiful when we're able to admit the things of our past without any shame, without any blame on ourselves, because those are things that are out of our control. But to be able to talk openly about it, I think is beautiful, because when we hold things in secret, those are works that the devil enjoys, right? He loves darkness. God calls us to come into the light and to be open and transparent, because we're not alone. Many people in this pandemic have been hurt. And it's one of the greatest concerns we have as teachers, is how many children have been virtual for now almost a year and have experienced that type of trauma. And we're not there to help them one-on-one directly. So my heart goes out to people that are struggling with a past experience or even a current experience I recently received a phone call about such an issue, and it was really upsetting because it's an issue that took place a long time ago, but only today were they able to express that. So we should acknowledge the courage it takes for someone to express that, and also how hard it is to cross the bridge of sharing, whether it's with adults or with our the people we love, our children, to help them understand what it means to have healthy relationships and healthy boundaries, and how beautiful God created us to enjoy a good relationship within a marriage context. It gets complicated when there's brokenness. So it's okay to have someone come along and take part of that journey of explaining, that you trust and has the proper verbiage to express it at the level in which the child is that you're trying to connect with.
I agree. Having like a safe circle of people always helps.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Pastor Ralph, for sharing. JR, you wanted to say something? You had your hand raised.
Okay. Yeah, no, just to add, I think kids know when you're nervous or you're hesitant to talk about something or an issue. I think depending on the kid's age, you could be honest to acknowledge that you're nervous and it's uncomfortable. But just to let that child know, like, but I feel like this is an important talk, and I've gone through a lot, and I went through a lot of pain, and it's a talk that could possibly prevent you from going through that same path. That's how I see it. I think being honest about how that parent feels also, because there are a lot of topics that as us parents that we're uncomfortable, and kids know it when we're uncomfortable. So I think just being with honest in that part, that's what I wanted to add.
Yes, parenting and having open conversations really opens up to vulnerability also. And when the time is right, depending on the maturity of your child, because at the end of all this, there is no one one size fits all type of parenting. You have to, the core of it all is to really to get to know your child. And I say core again, because let's be curious, let's be open, respectful, and empathetic with our children as we communicate with them. But at the same time, we open ourselves up to vulnerability. And because a lot of us have gone through, sexual traumas or things like that, it takes healing. But I like what JR said, we can let them know it's uncomfortable, but it's still a conversation that needs to be had. Yes, Ralph?
Yeah. And just also perspective, there's different stages of healing. Forgiving the person is a stage of healing, but when you could talk about something, it's a different level of healing. Someone who struggles with alcoholism, they might get to a stage of quitting and be able to resist the need to drink. But when they could finally say that I was an alcoholic and this is what has happened in my life and this is where I am today, they're at a different level of recovery. It's a healthier level too. So sometimes it's also like just saying to yourself, all right, God is challenging me in this scenario. Am I ready for this? And if not, it's okay to bring other people along to help you in this journey, but also keep in perspective, God's just trying to help you to go to that next stage of healing, which is a good place. So try to keep it in a positive mindset.
Yes, a positive mindset is indeed important. And I just want to ask Chen here. I know that you're here. I see your 3 little kids here in the picture. If you'd like to share something, I love her. I think she's just a great mother. And she still has very, very, very young children. So if you'd like to share something, Chen, you are welcome to share now.
Okay, this is our first time Zoom, whatever, saying something. But we are very interested with this topic. But, my children are still young. So we never really had this question yet. I didn't had this question from Oba yet. But if there is a practical advice that I could say when that time comes is, I think parents, especially the moms, because the moms always get these questions, especially with having girls, is to just have an open and honest communication. So especially with Justin and I, we don't have relatives here. We don't have daycare to put our children to. So our home is just really about communicating what is there. Like there is no secrets. They can hear whatever we're talking about, So we just hope that our children will think that we are a reliable source of information. So when that time comes that they ask us about that, I think you just have to be honest, as what Ati Jaylene and Johan said. We have to use the right terms because it will prevent confusion in the future. So especially my kids are going to school, so they get information here and then. So it's important to set a foundation of knowledge, being the parents, and you have to be like just using the terms that what normally would people say when they hear this information from others. In that way, I think they will have it in their mind that, oh, my mom said that this is about this and that. So they will already have the knowledge that they needed. And then they won't be persuaded to believe in how these other people tell them this information. So we are no experts about this even. So Justin and I, we think we just have to be open and not baby talk our children really, because they need that information from you as the parents. And also what I learned is you have to be selective with your answers. So when, for example, Leah is very curious child, she asks about privacy. Mama, what's privacy mean? So whenever we go to the bathroom, I always say, Leah, I need privacy. So at this age, she is asking about privacy. She is asking about the baby because she likes to play babies and mom and dad. But what she knows is the baby comes from the tummy, which is, it is there that we always tell them the but baby is in a special place in the tummy of the mom. And then she answers, yes, but the dad can't have it. So that is true. At least she has a little understanding. So it just depends on the stages of the children and of how you communicate to your children. At the end of the day, you're the parent, you know what to say, you know what to do. You're the only one who knows your child more than anybody, more than, anybody else in the world. So I think that's it.
Wow, I love that. Thank you, Chen. And you're right. As parents, although how insecure we might be, God has already equipped us to do so, because you're right, we do know our children best. And I think the ultimate goal here is that our kids will grow up not remembering that the talk happened, but that they have always known, because they've always had this openness with the parents. I'd like to thank everyone that came here today. I sometimes think that the 1 hour is sometimes just never enough, but let's keep this an ongoing conversation in our church community. I am here. I don't have all the answers, but I am a listening ear, and all the other church members, we can refer you. We have pastors that are willing to listen. Let's keep this an ongoing conversation so that we as a church community can help each other and support each other through these hard questions. And so at this time, I'd just like to invite everyone to please bow your heads and close your eyes, and let us close for prayer. Our Father, our God in heaven, Lord, I'd like to thank you for the wisdom that you have already equipped us all parents. Lord, help us to acknowledge that you have given us this responsibility, but to also know that you have already supplied us with all that we need. And Lord, help us to come to you so that we can come to you in wisdom. And Lord, I know that there are many here today that have experienced sexual trauma. Lord, I pray, Lord, that you give healing. And I pray, Lord, that the church community can be able to support each other and help each other in each of our individual lives as we move towards light and healing, oh Lord. And help us, Lord, to become better parents. Help us to equip our children and to guide them in your wisdom. In your loving and holy name I pray. Amen.